Jordan.
Oh, thanks for making this happen.
He is a great man, and we're so delighted to have him.
I was a student of his 12 years ago, so.
I think you got a B, too.
A little gray area there.
No, I'm teasing. He's an A student. Okay. Jim Mayfield. Who is he? There are 6 generations of Mayfields that were small, dirt, tenant farmers. Starting in 1652, Robert Mayfield arrived in Jamestown, Virginia, as an indentured servant and started working in a small farm. After the 5 years, he had to give that 5 years before he was free to do what he wanted. He started his own little farm, started another little farm, and then his son, Robert Jr., started a little farm in Virginia. Then the 3rd generation went to North Carolina, started a little farm, and then a series of about 4 Mayfields started little farms in Butts County, Georgia. And I am the result of that DNA process. And I want to say to you that I go back, my first experience with the third world was in the 6th grade, where I had to give a report on any country in the world. I had to pick a country and give a 15-minute presentation, and I selected Egypt, of all places. I have no idea where that came from. But suddenly I was drawn to the country of Egypt, and I'll explain the significance of that in just a minute. Then, from the time I was 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15, I spent my summers in a farm in McGrath, Alberta, Canada, where my uncle had a big farm and drove tractors, and I was a farmer in the summers, all during my early years in life. So my love and interest in rural areas goes back a long time. Now, in 5 days, I will be 83 years old. It sucks. I really wished I were 43. I have so much I want to do before this life ends. I have so much I want to do. Now, you have to understand something about Jim Mayfield. He doesn't have Alzheimer's, but he has sometimers, big time. Big time. And Lonnie knows what I'm going to tell you, why that is true. I love to get upgraded from economy class to business class. My bones ache when I'm cramped in an economy class seat, and I've been doing this for 60 years, and I don't like to fly for 8 hours in economy class. So I find ways to get upgraded. And I don't get it from CHOICE, unfortunately. They will give me an economy class ticket. So I get an email saying, Mr. Mayfield, if you would just get another 10,000 miles or so, you're now ready to move to platinum level. Fantastic. Automatic upgrade. Automatic upgrade. So where am I going to go to get another 10,000 miles? And I think, well, I could go to Tokyo, or I could go to Singapore, or I could fly over to Paris. But then I got this crazy idea. What I really should do is go back to Ecuador, Quito, and see the staff in Ecuador, spend a day with them, and then fly right back. Now, I told Chris Johnson I was going. I told my daughter in Las Vegas, because I flew out of Las Vegas, I told her, but guess who I forgot to tell? My wife. She suddenly hears that I'm in Ecuador.
This is last week, right?
This was 2 days ago. Anyway, poor Lonnie trying to explain to my wife why he might possibly be in Ecuador. Okay, so let's get on with the business of the hand. 1966, I am awarded a Fulbright scholarship. 2-year scholarship in Egypt. Going back to Egypt finally. First time, 1966. I'm there for a year, a little more than a year, and write a dissertation, get my PhD, and now I'm ready to start a career in rural development. I lived up and down the Nile Valley, spent 3 months in 3 different areas, one in the Delta area, one in a village outside where the pyramids are, and then one in a Christian village way up in Upper Egypt. And then spent the next 50 years going to Egypt on a regular basis, and recently finished a book based on my 50 years of working in rural Egypt. It's called Field of Reeds, and it's a history of my work in Egypt for 50 years. What's interesting about all of this is that it's 1974, and I get an assignment to work with U.S. aid in Egypt. I'm now, quote, a local expert on Egypt, and I have the research to prove it, and so I'm invited to Egypt to do an assignment. I happen to have learned Arabic in the Army Language School when I was a young captain in the U.S. Army in Monterey, California. Some of you may know the language school there in Monterey, and I studied Lugha Arabiya, learned Arabic, and so I thought I was going to the Middle East, but they sent me to Paris, France. Lived there for 5 years, never made it to the Middle East while I was in the Army, and learned a little French. But what was really intriguing is I'm sitting there in a village, 1974, and I'm asking this farmer, poor, absolutely poor family, how much do you make? How much do you make in a year? And translated it into about $297 a year, a little less than $1 a day. And when I heard that figure, it dawned on me that I had flown from Salt Lake City in business class with U.S. aid, paid all my expenses, and in 1974 they were paying me $300 a day. I was making in one day what this farmer made in a year. And then I realized that I'm going to be there for 30 days. That meant that I would make as much in 30 days as he would make in a lifetime. And it was then that I knew what my career was going to be. I was going to find out, why is this? Why is it that I make $300 a day and he makes $300 a year? Why is that? And that's where my passion comes from. Comes from seeing that. I remember visiting a family, 2 children, to a simple disease that's easily cured here, measles. 2 children died in this village. And I had worked in this village for about 6 months, and every single week, there were 2 or 3 children dying. Every week, 2 or 3 children would die in this one village, And when I was talking to him, I said, well, did you take them to the doctor? Couldn't the doctors help you? And he said, no, I didn't take them to the doctor. I have no money to pay a doctor. I had no choice. I had no choice. And my daughters are gone because I had no choice. And that for me is what choice is about. Choice is about giving people a choice in this world. And we are engaged in an amazing process, especially in the last few years. Now, let me just very quickly share with you what it's like living in a world of unintended consequences. What does it feel like? Well, in the 50s, I was taking some graduate courses in the 50s, and in the 50s, people were telling me that the way you eliminate extreme poverty or poverty in the world is to introduce some kind of a system like we have in the United States. We used to be farmers, but now we have companies and we have industries and we have factories, and that the key to eliminating poverty is to help Egyptians have factories, have industries. And all during the 50s, we were trying to encourage industrialization, the transfer of investment capital. We just give them capital, give them investment capital, they would start businesses, and the money eventually would trickle down to the farmers. But in fact, during the 50s, nobody was paying any attention to the farmers. The farmers were ignored. Rural areas were ignored all during the 50s. In the 60s, and so the unintended consequence was we wanted to help the poor. The United Nations, USAID, all of the organizations wanted to help the poor. But in fact, we ignored the real source of poverty, which is 80%, 90% of the people in the 1950s were living in rural areas. And they were not receiving any kind of help in the 1950s, almost nothing. So the 60s come along, and suddenly people say, well, wait a minute. If they're hungry and if they're poor, we need to give them seeds, high yield varieties kinds of seeds. We need to give them fertilizers. We need to give them tractors. And we need to give them insecticides. And it's called the Green Revolution of the 1960s. And I sat in graduate seminars in the early 60s listening to people talk about that it's very simple. We'll just introduce this high quality farming technology and the problem will be solved. I remember driving from Lahore in Pakistan over to Peshawar, which is right at the foot of the Khyber Pass going into Afghanistan in 1978. And as I'm driving, I'm with a USAID official. And I said, oh, look, there's a tractor in the field, and it's rusted, and it's not being used. And the USAID official said, well, these stupid farmers, they don't know how to take care of their tractors. By the time I got to Peshawar, I had counted 176 tractors sitting in fields not being used. Because the farmers are stupid. The farmers are illiterate. They're ignorant. They don't know how to take care of good things when we give it to them. So we decided in the night, so the unintended consequence was, who benefited from the Green Revolution? I'll tell you who benefited. It was the top 10% of farmers. The top 10% of the farmers in Egypt, in Bolivia, in Ecuador, in Philippines, the top 10% of the farmers benefited from this Green Revolution. And they benefited so well that they were able to buy up most of the good land, forcing the smaller farmers what? To migrate to the cities. And they're really, now they're living in slums and they're far worse off. At least they could grow a little bit of food on their land. But now we forced them off the rural areas, out of the rural areas into the cities. And if you've been to a third world big city, you know the tragedy of that 1960s approach to village development. 1970s, very nice. Mr. McNamara was the head of the World Bank. He introduced a concept he called it the basic needs approach. If we could just give people some basic education and some basic health and some basic services, We'd help them move out of extreme poverty. That would be the easy way to do that. The problem was, and I want you to think about this percentage, several $100 billion was spent in the 50s and the 60s and in the 70s. And by the end of the 70s, poverty was worse off than it was in the 50s. It was worse. People were living even in a more difficult situation. And only, I think the figure that I've heard is about 15 to 20% of the money allocated by the U.S. Congress through USAID and a number of other agencies, about 20% of that money actually got spent at the village level. Why? Very simple. Minister of Education, you were responsible to introduce education to the villages. Wonderful. We're happy to do that. But first, we need a new office building. I mean, the ministry has to have a new office building, and it has to be air conditioned. I mean, Egypt's hot. We bureaucrats have to have air conditioning. We can't function without air conditioning. And we need vehicles. 80% of the money was spent in Cairo or Manila. Okay? So the 70s was an area, the unintended consequence. We knew that they needed training. We knew that they needed these services, but the system was structured in such a way as to benefit the bureaucrats and the consultants.